So I'm going to kick off and ask these lovely authors some questions. But it's also an opportunity for you to ask any burning questions that you might have about these guys, their books, also their personalities, their internal workings, about the writing process leading up to their books being published, anything you like. And the way to do that is that there is a phone number on a little bit of card that's on your tables, and you're most welcome to text, and I'll get the messages here on my phone. Okay, so let me introduce you to everybody. This is Bruce Robinson, and he is the author of Behind the Tears, Understanding, Surviving and Growing from Suffering. Next we have Chris Watkin, who wrote Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. Jodie McIver, and her book is called Bringing Forth Life, God's Purpose in Pregnancy and Birth. And finally, Brian Rosner, balancing out either side of me, thank you. How to Find Yourself is your book. Why Looking Inward is Not the Answer. So if you have any questions about their books and authors, do text in and I'll read them at a later date. Bruce, I'll start with you. You don't write books for a living, I'm pretty sure. So tell us a little bit about your day job and how that connects with your latest book.
Yeah, so I'm a physician, and so my day job is to see patients that have lung diseases, including cancer, of course, and I also do research into cancer, amongst other things. And there's an obvious link why I got to write this book is that I have had to break the bad news of cancer and do the journey to the end with hundreds and hundreds of people, many of them Christians. And they asked the question, why? So I've also done a lot of work in disaster zones where innocent victims by the hundreds of thousands are present. So I was getting asked to speak to Christian groups, and I actually, instead of answering the why question, I would talk about how. How do you respond to suffering as a Christian? How? Different three-letter word. And that's come out of my practice. And so when I did that a few times, I was told, you have to write a book. Wagging finger, you have to write a book, because it's incredibly helpful to learn about how, rather than all these books that are just talking about why, theological, etc. And it's because of my vast experience as a Christian at the coalface that I wrote this book.
It's wonderful. It's immensely practical. I loved all the practical tips. I particularly love that you actually had a chapter in your book that said, let's look after the carers of those that are suffering as well, and that they were just as valid and important as those who are suffering in a way, that they need just as much care. Just one off the top of your head, if you remember, I'm pretty sure you will. What is one good thing to say to someone in the midst of suffering and one thing not to say to someone in the midst of suffering?
That is a great question. So if you imagine after church and there's someone in the congregation who's dying of cancer, most people don't know what to say, and some people who think they know what to say actually don't, and they say things that are unhelpful or hurtful. My suggestion of what not to say are the following. I'll just pick one, right?
Well, pick one. Yeah.
I'm sure God has a purpose in this.
Yeah.
You would be surprised to know how often that is said. And there's a list of other ones in the book. And I'll tell you what you can say. Try to say nothing for a while. Put your hand... There's two ways to show empathy. I have a strategy for Christians what to do. One is to put your hand on their forearm. The other one is what I call the hug that lingers. The hug that lingers. It's got empathy.
Brian's getting ready.
Brace yourself. You know, the hug lingers, and it says more than any words, because, and I'll finish with this, words can be hurtful. And most people who say hurtful things don't know they're saying hurtful things. But words can be really helpful, but actions of empathy. I said it was the last thing I'm going to...
That's all right.
What did Jesus do when Lazarus died? He wept. He didn't go into a whole bunch of, I'm sure God has a purpose in this. He did actually say that at other times, but not in the acute suffering.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're in a venue, in a place with people who know that words matter immensely and have great power. So that's a really great reminder for us to think about what we say. And also when we run out of things to say is to simply sit with people in silence, and that is sufficient. Thank you so much, Bruce. Yeah, absolutely. It's a wonderful book. Chris, I'm going to turn to you now at the far end. You're an academic and you do in fact write books and articles for a living. How did biblical theory come about? How did it connect with the work that you do and also your journey as a Christian person?
Thank you, Bei-En. I guess I tried to write the book that I wanted to read as an undergraduate.
600 pages that you wanted
That's
to read?
right, yeah. Not that part of it. I was in a secular university studying an arts degree, and, you get thrown these philosophers every week, Nietzsche and Foucault and Derrida, and you've got to try and make sense of them. And then I was, a relatively young Christian as well, trying to be faithful to the Bible and trying to work out what these two worlds have got to do with each other. And the stuff that I read at the time either seemed to suggest that Christians really should just simply denounce all this stuff. That was the posture that we should adopt. Or other people were saying, no, we need to remake the church in the image of this philosophy. This is, the next Reformation. And neither of those seemed to resonate with the Bible to me. And so there must be something better. There must be something else to say. And then over the years, listening to lots of people, reading different books and, sort of sitting under the teaching of different people, you piece little bits together. And the book is the piecing together of all those different influences and what I wish I'd been able to read when I was an undergrad.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I've got some way through it, I would say. It is one that I will keep going back to, I think, for years to come. I did want to ask one other question, though. The title, Biblical Critical Theory. What exactly is a critical theory, and what is a biblical critical theory?
It's a really helpful question, because I think there's a sense that sort of circulates broadly in society that's probably not super helpful. So there's a broad sense and a narrow sense. The broad sense is the first one that I came across when I was an undergrad. We had a unit, we did modern critical theory. And it was everything from Nietzsche onwards, sort of your Marxes and your Freuds, your Julia Kristevas, your Simone de Beauvoirs, all those people. And looked at in that broad sense, a critical theory does three things with the world, if you like. It makes certain ways of being in the world viable, in the sense that they become possible for you. So most of us in the room wouldn't think that a revolution is possible, I would suspect. And yet you read a bunch of Marx and you say, oh, okay, yeah, I can see what he means, how that sort of thing might happen. And a critical theory also makes things visible. Think of the different feminisms that there are and the way in which they draw our attention to the way in which women are unequally treated in society in ways that we may not have noticed otherwise. And they also make things valuable. Desire this, look for this, and a lot of the critical theories that I was studying were saying value, the transgression of norms. That's what you should be seeking. So they make stuff visible, viable, and valuable. And the Bible, as we read it, is doing a very similar thing. Now, it's not all that the Bible is doing, of course. The Bible is also making us wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. It's the sword of the Spirit. But alongside all that, it's making certain things viable. So, for example, if we walked out onto the street now and said to people, how about trusting the promises of the God of the Bible? They would just say, what planet have you landed from? That's ridiculous. Yeah. But you read enough of the Bible, you see, okay, this is a God who keeps his promises, and I can see what that might look like. And the Bible makes things visible as well. In the Old Testament, the widows and orphans. Look at these people. Notice these people who often go invisible in society. Or, the heavens declare the glory of God. Notice when you look up at a beautiful sunset like the one we had this evening, that's God's glory. So it makes things visible, and it also makes things valuable. Serving other people, for example. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. To give his life as a ransom for many. Service is something you should value, that you should desire. And so in these ways, the Bible is doing what these critical theories do. Now, obviously with very different content, but it's making things viable and visible and valuable in the same way that they are.
Wonderful. That is very comprehensive, and thank you so much. I think viable, visible, valuable, 3 Vs. I'll remember that. Do talk to, incidentally, Chris at any point during the break, because he can explain Foucault to you in 5 minutes, and I think that's pretty impressive. I have just heard it a couple of weeks ago, so I know you can do it. No pressure. Jodie, I want to turn to you, and I know that you professionally work as a midwife and that this is your very first book. Is that correct? Yeah, and it's already been shortlisted.
Absolutely. I never aspired to be a writer. I'm much of a people person, but I've loved writing this book, yeah.
This is great. And I feel like you are sort of uniquely placed to write a book about pregnancy and birth, being a midwife, but also being a theological student and someone who's well versed in theology. And I read your book in one sitting. And I have to say, I have never been more excited about placentas in my whole life.
They're amazing.
It's amazing. They're
yes.
amazing. They're just, anyway, I will tell you all about how amazing they are at some point if you want to hear. But it was an extraordinary mixture of sensible medical advice, accurate, sensible advice, lots of stories about women going through pregnancy and birth. So I'm not pregnant, and I don't have a child, so that was an amazing thing to sort of glimpse into that. And also theological reflections of God giving birth to a new people through Christ. So that was a wonderful combination of things. Let me recommend this book to everyone in the room. You don't have to be pregnant to read it. But in your book, you tell a story at the beginning about how you were present at the birth of both your siblings, your 2 younger siblings, Tan and Tim.
Yeah,
and you would have
right.
been 3 and 6 respectively.
Yeah.
I think that's extraordinary and very unusual. Why did your parents do that?
Well, my dad's here. You can ask
Peter,
him.
yes, you could.
Perhaps it was more my mum's decision,
Yeah, and what impact did it have on you to be part of that?
Lots of people have asked me this, and I think it's probably not a coincidence that I did end up as a midwife. But I think what it achieved was that this was just a normal part of family life.
Yeah.
And watching my mother give birth wasn't a horrifying or traumatizing experience. It was the way we met our new little family members, and it was a good way that the human body works, and it's a powerful act to witness as a child, I think. So I'm sure it did have an impact, but honestly, as a kid, you just take things in your stride, and it's just part of life, and it goes on. And so for me, it was normal to watch your brother and sister be born, but obviously that's not the case for the majority of people.
Yeah, it's great. I'm really dying to ask Peter some questions later on.
Catch him at the break.
Catch him, absolutely. That you also in your book write about the fact that through parenthood, I might read the quote actually, that we need not step out of parenthood for spiritual life and growth, but rather lean into it. So even if we're too exhausted to notice, God is changing us through our experience of parenthood as we prioritise a needy little person. How do you think God changes us through that experience? And would you regard birth as sort of an intrinsically religious experience, regardless of anyone's explicit faith?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I've seen women who have no particular faith background after giving birth and holding their baby sort of express the miraculous nature of that experience. I think, though, today we do kind of downplay birth, and it's behind closed doors, and we focus on it very much as simply a medical event. But pregnancy, birth, I think, they're the portal into parenthood, but they're also shaping us and acting in us as our body stretches and opens and gives of ourselves for this little person. So I think there's a very real sense in which from the very beginning we are being changed to put another first, and that obviously continues on long after birth into parenthood. But I think that's not a coincidence, and God has an amazing design of our bodies, and it's powerful in that in some ways we are walking in Jesus' footsteps in this way as we give of our bodies and our blood to bring forth life of a little person that we don't even know, may have nothing in common with you. Well, hopefully something, but yeah.
Yeah, it's always my fear. I always am afraid that I'll give birth to a child who likes mathematics and I just can't do any of that. Anyway, just to portal into my internal musings. It's an extraordinary book. Thank you so much for writing it. I think, as one of the judges said, it's a book that we've never seen before. I think no one's actually paid attention to the actual act of giving birth, and so that's been wonderful to read.
Yeah, that's what I found. There were no Australian Christian books on the topic, so I felt like that was a real gap.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for filling it. Great. Last but not least, Bei-En. Bei-En, I know this was also a deeply personal book for you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book?
Yes, I don't think you can write about personal identity impersonally. I've been thinking about this topic for 25 years, actually, and this is my second book on the subject. I've been doing other things as well. But in the late 90s, I had a crisis of identity of sorts myself. And being a Christian, I went back to the Bible to find some help and some old truths that had been very important to me, such as knowing God gave life its challenge and so on, were less important at that point. And I found some new truths that were immensely reassuring and gave me comfort and purpose and direction. So I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. The odd thing is that in the last 25 years, I found more and more people who are also thinking about this topic. And I've found people in all sorts of different stages and circumstances of life who have been questioning their identity and asking who they really are. People, obviously teenagers, but also people in their 30s. There's something called a thrisis, where it's not something you need ointment for, but it's where you climb the ladder of success and then find it's leaning against the wrong building. You're at the cusp ages, 40, 50, 60 and so on. You really wonder about where your life's gone and why you haven't achieved what you'd hoped to achieve, all those kinds of things. So I think our society's never had more of an emphasis on finding yourself and being true to yourself, but there's this awful irony that it's actually more difficult than ever because of the way in which we undertake that task.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted to ask, one of the things that you talk about at length in your book is that we often tend to be told by society to go deep within ourselves, to find ourselves. And then you paraphrase Jesus' very paradoxical statement in John, if you want to find yourself, you must lose yourself, essentially. How does that work exactly?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the crux of the book, what's called expressive individualism. The idea in our day that you should just look inward to find yourself, and what you find there you make all important, and you expect everyone to celebrate that, and then you follow your heart and live your dreams and so on. There's certain problems with that. Obviously, looking inward's a good idea at one level, but there are other places to look. And you're right, the Lord Jesus, it's uncanny, I think. Can you imagine a more appropriate statement in our day, that those who find themselves will lose themselves, and those who lose themselves for my sake, he said, will find themselves. It's in all four Gospels, actually.
Right.
And one of the wonderful things about doing the research for this book over the years has been to find that the Bible addresses our postmodern issues with such pertinence and relevance and beauty and power. A lot of stuff that actually has never been noticed before. I think it's testimony to the inspiration of Scripture, actually. Yes, but the Lord Jesus himself speaks about this matter at several points.
Thank you, Bei-En. I also love the way that, I think there's a phrase that you had in the book where you talked about putting yourself into the story of Jesus, which I thought was so helpful. It made me think about I'm not so small anymore, and that I'm part of a bigger picture, but also that I'm part of a big picture with everyone else in the church as well. So that was tremendous.
Yeah, you've got the choice between being a star in your own short story, which is possibly going to end up a farce or a tragedy, or you can have a walk-on role in God's grand plan of redemption. And I recommend the latter.
Great, thank you so much. Please buy Bei-En's book and read all about it. It's wonderful. I I have one final question that I'm going to throw open to everybody, so feel free to chime in. And it's a general question of what was the most challenging thing about writing this book? I know many of you wrote it during COVID conditions. And maybe what was the most surprisingly enjoyable thing about writing your books? So feel free to jump in, and that'll be our last question.
I'll say an enjoyable thing, because
Yes.
I did rather enjoy it, surprisingly. I feel like what was lovely about writing a book was that I had in my mind, you know, the people, the women, the families that I've cared for in ministry and as a midwife. And beyond that, those I would never meet in person, but to be able to be offering, in a sense, a kind of pastoral care for those beyond that was a real joy, and I felt a real sense of God's purpose in that. Yeah,
It's brilliant. Great.
The hardest thing about writing the book was writing it in a personal fashion, because I'm an academic by trade, and so I'm used to this kind of pretending to be dispassionately objective. And I was pushed by friends and editors and readers to and fro to make sure that I did actually talk about myself for once in a book, or for twice. I did it in the previous book as well. The most lovely thing about writing the book was finding how helpful the material is to a variety of people, because in my work, I'm very privileged. I have the opportunity to test drive ideas just every day at college and in other speaking and writing opportunities, and people of all sorts of ages and stages have found the material I discovered in the Bible to be immensely helpful to them personally.
Wonderful. Feel free.
The hardest thing I found writing about suffering from the point of view of how is worrying about the people who are actually suffering or caring for sufferers who are reading it. Because having said, don't fill them up with words, but be empathic, I've now got words on a page. So the way I dealt with that was I had these huggy bears at the end of most of the chapters that sort of tried to communicate my empathy to anyone who might read it and misunderstand, you know, that I wanted them to know that, because I've been down this road so often, you know, where, etc. So I wanted to communicate that in the text, which was pretty hard. The best part was actually getting stories from people. So my book is full of stories that are engaging and quite moving, I think, my own as well. And to hear from people who've, you know, had to deal with someone, a partner who's got cancer, a pastor who's got cancer at a young age, we had a few of them, a mother whose daughter was murdered, and on it goes. Christians, how do they deal with it? And so it's such a beautiful thing to hear people willing to share. People who've had disabled children. I mean, I could go on. Yeah. As Christians, how did they deal with it? And again, it's the how rather than the why. It's that other three-letter word. And it was actually a beautiful... And I had tears on the keyboard.
Yeah.
Myself.
Thank you. Last word.
Just to echo that, I was hearing at the table a moment ago a little bit about Bruce's ministry and checking out your website earlier today. It really is a remarkable work. And if anyone hasn't been on Bruce's website, I'd really recommend it. It's a wonderful thing that the Lord has involved you with. For me, the hardest and the most rewarding was sort of the same thing, but it started off hard and ended up rewarding. In that, so the book goes through from Genesis to Revelation. Yes. And often I get to a bit of the Bible and I think, oh, there's not going to be much here. You know, sort of eschatology and cultural engagement, where, you know, I'll squeeze out a conclusion or something like that, and then you start digging. You think, oh my goodness, there's so much in the book of Revelation to do with how we relate to contemporary culture. And I just never noticed it. And so the problem then becomes, it's a lovely problem to have, what do I leave out? You know, it's already too big, so what am I gonna cut? And just seeing that happen, the wisdom literature was another example. So, am I going to get a chapter out of the wisdom literature? And at the end it was, can I get it down to a chapter, you know? And just seeing again and again that the Lord has so stacked his word with wisdom that the more you dig, the more you find, and you don't stop finding. And, you know, shame on me for thinking there are going to be bits of the Bible that I'm just going to have to sort of whistle on past because there's not much there. Not at all. Yeah, every genre of the Bible, every moment of the Bible has such riches and unique riches for cultural engagement. You know, without the wisdom literature, you couldn't.
You lose out on something
There's a
else.
bit of the jigsaw that is uniquely the wisdom literature. You can't get that from it. And, you know, all the images of Revelation as well, they're doing something that no other bit of the Bible is doing. So just seeing that was just lovely. And also a headache.
Yeah, I'm reminded as you were talking about, you know, Ecclesiastes, of the reading of books there is no end, but of the writing of them there's also no end if you want to get down that path. That's wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much for the four of you. If you could put your hands together for Bei-En and Bruce and Chris and Jodie.